All right. Well, welcome. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. And on behalf of Duke-Margolis, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar. Couldn't be more timely on ensuring pull incentives for priority antibiotics succeed. We are joined by a diverse and distinguished set of speakers for the event today. We're looking to think going forward about the most effective ways to implement, support, and implement pull incentives as part of an overall strategy of addressing the serious and worsening American and global problem of antimicrobial resistance by bringing new, novel, effective antibiotics to market and assuring that they can be sustained there, both from a domestic and a global perspective. As I said, we think it's a very good time for this discussion. The idea of pull incentives and of subscription model or market entry focused rewards that are not linked to the traditional volume-based way of paying for medical products. Those ideas have been around for a while, but they appear to be getting new momentum and new support. Just this week, the updated version of the bipartisan cures legislation included a provision for the Pasteur Act, as you'll hear more about during this session. So strong bipartisan support in the United States for moving forward on this effort, building on legislation that has been introduced in previous sessions of Congress. And just today, yesterday and today, the U.S. government announced a new commitment to expanding manufacturing capacity, particularly for vaccines, but a recognition that more robust support for not only developing products quickly and effectively to meet important public health needs, but reliable supports for getting those products out to people who need them also seems to be getting more support. So we're going to come back to those issues today. During the program today, if you go, I think go to the next slide, we have several sessions. Our first session is going to be in two parts. It's going to begin with a presentation from Kevin Otterson on his recent modeling regarding the size of the global pull incentives needed for these priority antibacterials to get them to the market and sustain them on the market globally. We'll talk about how different components of Kevin's model affect the size of an effective pull incentive and how successful pull incentives have maximum impact should complement existing efforts to advance novel antibiotics and their use, like funding for early stage research, clinical trials, stewardship, and surveillance, and how there are also some complementary policy opportunities, both from a legislative and administrative standpoint, to leverage the impact of these incentives even further. So we'll talk about some additional actions, administrative actions from CDC, CMS, other health and human services agencies here in the United States that could bolster public health preparedness and improve the resilience and the robustness of our market to protect the public against antimicrobial resistance. And we'll then go in session 2 to discuss how this work in the United States fits into the global context, where similarly there are important steps underway to move to this new and potentially much more effective approach to stabilizing and energizing the availability of innovative antimicrobials. We are very glad to have you all with us, and we want this to be an interactive session. If you do have any questions or comments along the way, please submit them through the Zoom Q&A function on our Zoom webinar template, and we will take some time during each session to incorporate as many of these questions and comments as possible. So I'd like to get us started by just providing a brief context for the issues that we're going to discuss today in more detail with the speakers. This interest in addressing antimicrobial resistance and promoting the development of effective novel antibiotics, diagnostics, and surveillance systems all are part of this approach. Again, we're focusing specifically on the new developments related to pull incentives for novel antibiotics, which are primarily designed to get through those later phases of development, like the large pivotal clinical trials, the regulatory review and approval process at FDA, including for manufacturing, and keeping those products stable on the market once they are developed and approved. And in that context, we'll try to bring in the broader ecosystem where, again, in the context we're living in now of the pandemic and increased public attention to public health preparedness and security, how improvements in response there, how other trends in improving clinical trials and evidence development, including the use of real-world evidence, can also contribute. The next slide, just a reminder about there are a whole set of supports needed to stabilize and enable a viable antimicrobial resistance market, because so much of the benefits of these antimicrobials against resistant organisms go not to the people who are taking them, but to the broader populations who are at risk for resistant infections if we don't contain them effectively, if we don't have on hand a robust supply of what Kevin and John Rex have called the fire extinguishers of preventing spread of resistant organisms over time. So the main beneficiaries are not the people or their health plans who are paying the bill for that particular antibiotic, but the broader society that gains from having well-controlled, effective, well-designed, effective tools available when they're needed before the antimicrobial resistance can spread, have a bigger direct impact on human life, as well as disrupt the way we practice medicine, provide surgeries, enable people who are at higher risk of infections to interact, and so on. Large societal costs. We're not going into those details today. The push funding and research partnerships are very important at the front end of this development process. We have a number of them listed on the slide. There have been a lot of efforts to develop these tools, but what we've mainly found is that those are not adequate by themselves. So a need for pull incentives that can help the most promising candidates that make it through initial clinical development, through that advanced development process, getting more definitive evidence, getting to commercialization, getting to the point where we can really learn about how well they work after they've been approved. We clearly have more to do here. The last few decades, while some successes in getting some products developed have not led to any significant number of products from new types of classes or designs actually reaching the market, and those that do get to the point where they can get to market have had trouble sustaining themselves in the absence of a strong pull incentives like the ones that are starting to be implemented and they've been proposed, like Pasteur on the right side of this chart. And the next slide, part of the reason here again is that you can't expect the sales returns from traditional fee-for-service payments to reflect the value of these products, if effective, to society. There's been a lot of work summarizing this value, also summarizing the cost of novel antibiotic R&D development, and then again getting to the market and remaining on the market. This chart on the left breaks those down. You can see there's some costs in the areas that the push incentives help with. That's a relatively small proportion of the total, though. Much bigger are the costs of advanced clinical development, the so-called phase 3 trials, and then costs associated with launch, the manufacturing review to make sure the product's being reliably manufactured, and then costs associated with getting on the market after the FDA approval, the manufacturing, distribution, the additional learning about additional indications for use, since typically initial approval is quite narrow. And it just doesn't work with traditional payment models where at the time a product is approved, even if it's a very promising one, there'll only be a limited amount of evidence, typically from so-called non-inferiority studies in one or a few particular indications. So that's not going to lead to necessarily a whole lot of confident use by itself. In addition, clinical adoption tends to be slow, and we want to have effective stewardship programs for these new products so that they will only be used where they're really needed, so that they too don't become victims of resistance developing any more quickly than possible. So a big gap between what the current market provides and what the pull incentives are designed to fill in to make these products more reliably available. And next slide. It's also worth noting that there are broader supports that could potentially help address these issues of antimicrobial resistance and antibiotic development as well. This broader set of a U.S. action plan, national action plan, includes attention to prevention and stewardship to reduce the need for new antimicrobials, surveillance systems to understand how we're doing with our current array and how a new product, if it gets to market, actually impacts the emergence of resistance, as well as diagnostics that can help target the use of antibiotics more effectively, and then collaboration, public and private United States with healthcare systems, with payers to support better models of care for antibiotic use that are focused on population health, not just use of an individual product, and better collaborations globally as well. And next slide. These pull incentives can therefore be complemented by additional steps to support antibiotic development. First off, the pull incentives need to be appropriate in size and scope, and we're going to hear a lot about that today. In addition, there are other ways to bring down the cost and improve the leverage, improve the impact that funding for pull incentives can provide through steps like a easier clinical trial infrastructure to conduct studies of antimicrobial resistance, made possible by progress on electronic medical records and the implementation of more platform studies and more real-world evidence programs around the country and around the world. Also, efforts aimed at public health preparedness, like these investments in manufacturing capacity. Again, U.S. just announced some just ahead of this meeting, and investments in supply chain resilience, something that will be a high priority for for Congress going forward in public health preparedness. And also support for rapid diagnostics, additional reporting on antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance. If we have good systems for that, we'll really be able to learn more effectively about how valuable any new antibiotic is in practice and help us target our funding to developing and sustaining those products on the market. Along with that, too, incentives for appropriate use, not paying on a fee-for-service basis, but again, in our healthcare systems, in CMS and our private payers, moving towards paying based on appropriate use and outcomes for a population, not based on volume of use. So we'll touch on some of these issues as well. Next slide, along with these steps to complementary efforts, antibiotic development that I've just described. Here we're summarizing those in the slide: clinical trial improvements, preparedness and manufacturing capacity, post-market evidence development, and rapid and accurate diagnostics, and appropriate incentives and supports and systems for antibiotic use and real-world evidence development. So on the next slide, just a reminder that this is a total global problem as well. We're dealing with some other big major global threats, including emergency response to the pandemic, as well as global warming. This is in that same category of a global public health threat. So to the extent we can develop complementary policies in these directions, not only in the U.S. but other countries, we're going to be more effective at dealing with this global threat. The good news is a number of similar initiatives around pull incentives, around these other steps, are in process now. We'll hear about the UK subscription pilot, about some other reforms being undertaken in Europe and the rest of the world today as well. So lots to cover, and it's now my pleasure to kick this off by turning to Kevin Otterson. Kevin from Boston University has been a longtime leader in the issue of pull incentives in particular, but dealing with antimicrobial resistance in general. And he's going to kick off the webinar describing his recently published research modeling of the appropriate size of a global pull incentive. Kevin?
Thank you for that great introduction, Mark, and orienting everybody to the situation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the price for solving this global collective action problem. But first, I want to label all the impressive list of people who I'm not speaking for today. This is entirely my own academic work. It doesn't reflect anyone else's input or funding. We have to get this point across that modern medicine really relies on antibiotics. When I hear questions about, well, is 11 billion over a decade at Pasteur too much? I say, do you understand how much all of medicine relies on the safety net of antibiotics? If we got that point across, I think that would be valuable. And that the market fails to reward for the value of these, that we have great scientific success here is being ground into the dust by the economics. And the incentive, the amount that's needed, to solve this problem globally is actually remarkably small. Think of one of the other global collective action problems like climate change, and the price tag to fix that. The price tag for our issue, remarkably affordable. It's something on the order for Pasteur of 1 latte per American per year. It's not that much. And then I'll talk through my health affairs article, the range for the global antibacterial subscriptions, are fully delinked. The best estimate is 3.1 billion is the global number, and that includes both the support for R&D and the purchasing of the drug for the countries that are participating. And you see a significant range. I'll talk about that. And it's over a decade. It's fully delinked. And the takeaway is that the Pasteur Act is well within this range, which is another way of saying it will be effective in restoring private investment to this space. Similarly, the UK pilot, if you consider the UK's role in the global economy or the G20 economy, it's also within this range, which is good news for both of those programs. Mark's already talked about this a little bit. Feel free to steal this slide and improve it. This is what I call the enablement. Everything in medicine, if we didn't have antibiotics, would be slower, more costly, more dangerous, right? And we could add 30 other columns to this. But that first column on cancer, in the recent article that I was a co-author on in the Clinical Journal of the American Cancer Society, the number 2 cause of death for people with cancer is still infection, right? We have to drive this point home. This is work that reflects what they're doing in England with the study value, thinking about the different ways that we should value antibiotics on a social level, a societal level. Enablement is one of those, but there's others. John Rex, his fire extinguisher on the right. We know what's happened with the companies recently. We know that out of the 18 new antibiotics that are approved by the FDA in the last decade, 7 of them either went through bankruptcy or were ground into something close to bankruptcy as a result of this marketplace. This was a different study that looked at the rich countries in the G7, plus 7 additional high-income countries in Europe. And again, for all the drugs that have been approved in the past decade by the US, Europe, Canada, or Japan, there's 18. And you can see that a lot of these drugs are not being launched even in high-income countries. And Canada wins or loses, I guess losing, coming in with only 2 out of the 18 here. But that tells you something. If your goal is global access for everywhere in the world, the fact that the companies aren't able to launch commercially, even in a place like France or Germany or Denmark or something, even though they already have EMA approval, right? So the only incremental cost at that point is setting up, supply in that country and figuring out how you get it distributed and reimbursed within a country. That's enough of a barrier to prevent commercial launch. So this is a very serious situation. In the high-income world, even more serious if you look to the rest of the world. So this is some of the reasons why I think it isn't working. Antibiotics, if you use them correctly, you prevent transmission. Other people don't get sick. How do you charge for that exactly? We want to use narrow-spectrum antibiotics and less of them. Why? Because we want bacterial evolution to be less dangerous over time. How do you make any money doing that? How is that, is anyone offering a premium for a narrow-spectrum antibiotic? And the answer is no. It's easy to free ride. All those different categories on the enablement slide, they're not contributing directly or indirectly to antibiotic R&D. And also this preparedness issue. We really need to have these drugs and use them very sparingly for maybe the first 5 or 10 or 20 years. Meanwhile, the patent is expired, so that we're ready for when bacteria finally make it so that we have to use that drug. It's available. And so the preparedness value is paying for antibiotics that we don't need today, but want to have on the shelf as an insurance or safety valve for the future. And we're completely skimping on all of those today. So push incentives, Carbacks were a large push incentive. I won't belabor it today. This is a version of a slide that Mark has already shown, so I won't use that one as well. But this is a key point on delinkage. Carbacks is an innovation organization. We're trying to create new molecules and get them into patients. But if that's all you care about and you don't worry about global access or stewardship, then you're wasting the drugs or being unjust in how they're being distributed around the world. Also, if you're just a stewardship house and all you care about is stewardship, let's be really careful with these drugs. That will cut off access to people who might need them. It's going to make it more difficult. And if you never sell the drug, you're a perfect steward or almost never sell it. How is any company going to make money in this space? So the point is you need to do all three of these things together. And delinkage, paying for value, not volume, is really the leading way to achieve all three objectives simultaneously, which is why I wanted to look at what would it cost for the globe, the whole planet, to do a subscription model, as well as market entry rewards and other options. So this is the research question for the article. It appeared in Health Affairs in November of this year. And it's fully transparent. That link at the bottom is the model itself, the Excel model with all the data backup, is in the public domain. You don't have to click through Health Affairs to get the model. It's there so that everyone can see every assumption and can test them. And as data improves, you can put that new data in and see how it changes the numbers. I did that to make this as transparent and as replicatable as possible. There's also a lot of supplemental appendix data that the link is in the Health Affairs articles, 50, 60 pages worth of detail on how I got to where I went. So let's go to the results. The results is I took a look at subscription, which is sub 10, so a 10-year subscription, market entry reward, all paid at once, global peak year sales, which is the GPYS, if you just went with the sales model, which is not delinked at all. And then those first two, I overlaid it with an acquisition model. What happens if a larger company acquires the asset when it's phase 2 ready for development? For the reasons described in the article, I think the best estimate is the acquisition business cases. And if you wanted to look at the subscription, that was the number I gave at the beginning, that the $3.1 billion is the best estimate, and then the range from 2.2 to 4.8. And so that is the sub 10 plus AC is the goal of that is to estimate what the global need for Pasteur in the UK model would be. The market entry rewards are cheaper, but it's really illusory in some ways because subscription includes both the R&D incentive as well as payment for the product itself. The federal government won't pay anything extra for this product under Pasteur, whereas in a market entry reward, it's a one-time prize or cash to the company. They still sell the product in the market under normal circumstances under market entry reward. Those cost of sales and those revenues are not shown as costs here. And so it's important to recognize that. The global peak year sales numbers are higher than any recent antibiotic. I think it's an unreasonably high expectation in our current markets. And just to note, the ranges are high, and especially because there's a lot of data uncertainty in the preclinical phases that makes it difficult to really know exactly where you're at. So when I say best estimate and then ranges, I really mean ranges. You have to understand that too much precision here, I think the data doesn't support too much precision. All right. I did a lot of sensitivity testing, and so like this first line is preclinical. What happens if you modulate the preclinical cost sharing? So how many push incentives are out there? I assumed in the model that the successful molecule that gets a Pasteur award, that half of its costs would be covered by preclinical push incentives like Carbacks or NIAID and many other things. But if you modify that assumption and reduce it or increase it, it has substantial effects. If you eliminated push incentives, it would add more than $1 billion to the cost of the pull incentive. Likewise, if you change some of the assumptions on global peak year sales. So I've assumed here, based on data from the last 18 antibiotics, how they've sold, that the global peak year sales for a median antibiotic is 241 million. There's really actually no antibiotic currently that's reached that, but that was the upper level assumption. If you assume that antibiotics become blockbusters, that they start selling $1 billion worth of drug globally, then of course you need less of a pull incentive, right? So you can see how these impact the sensitivity testing. But the overall picture is that everything in blue, everything on the right, most of the uncertainty actually trends towards a larger pull incentive as opposed to a smaller. So there's a couple things to really focus on. This is some of my academic hat on here, but the data that we have on the cost, duration, probability of success, et cetera, of antibiotic R&D is based on extensions of known classes. It's what we've done the past couple of decades. But what we want to do here is a first in class or something extremely novel and highly innovative. Those projects are likely to be slower, more costly, higher risk of failure. If so, the pull incentive would need to be larger. I've already talked about ranges, and also, and I see Lynn Philpy is on the program. As other countries adopt pull incentives or other things, there's need for adjustment. In this model, I've only included at this point the UK pull incentive, not any others from any other countries, because that would be speculative at this point. So my conclusion, push and pull incentives totaling several $1 billion per drug globally are required for this thing to work and to attract commercial sponsors. I think the acquisition business case is the most appropriate. If you want to know what the global number for Pasteur should be, 3.1 billion with that range, fully delinked over a decade. And these estimates are well within those ranges. So I think Pasteur will be effective in returning private investment to this space. And I think I'll stop with that. Thank you for your attention.
Great, Kevin. Thanks very much for that excellent, concise presentation of work from your report. I would like to now open this up to broader participation, including from Kevin, but some additional members of our panel. And I'm very pleased to have with us Neil Clancy, who's the Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, Joseph Larson, Vice President for Strategic Portfolio Development at Venatorx Pharmaceuticals, Monique Mansoura. Monique, good to see you again, Executive Director of Global Health Security and Biotechnology for the MITRE Corporation, and Arjun Srinivasan, who's Associate Director for Healthcare-Associated Prevention Programs at the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention. As I said, we're going to try to do this in two parts. First is focusing on this particular analysis and its implications for how we move forward with pull incentives from a policy standpoint. And then we're going to kind of broaden that out to other supports and how this can fit in with a more effective comprehensive strategy for reliable development and availability of the antimicrobials that we need. And Kevin, maybe I could just start with you on this. And I touched on this a little bit in my introduction, and you did too in your overall summary of the recent research. But I think what a lot of people don't recognize is there's a substantial cost to not only developing these antimicrobials, and people focus a lot on the so-called pivotal trials, the phase 3 clinical trials. That can be expensive and hard to do for an antimicrobial. But then there are a lot of costs that come after that. Could you expand a little bit on those components? Manufacturing and manufacturing review and approval by FDA, ongoing needs for post-market activity to maybe expand out the indications that might come beyond an initial non-inferiority approval, things like that?
So 3 quick things. One is that on post-approval costs for antibiotics, just to steer people towards the occasion presentation at ASM ESMID Antibiotic Drug Development Conference here in Boston in 2019. It was really eye-opening on the decisions that these single asset companies have to make a couple of years before FDA approval in order to have a supply chain ready. All the CMC costs that are engaged that aren't normally counted as phase 3 costs, because people sometimes will say, well, how much is a phase 3 study? And they're thinking about just the study. They're not talking about, considering all of the good manufacturing, GMP that you have to do to have material for the study, but also the decisions that are made years in advance so that you have a factory someplace that'll produce that thing so that you can actually sell it the day that the FDA approves it. And it's really hundreds of millions of dollars. I had to go in and look at some of these estimates, and some of them were just the studies in the published literature. Some included some CMC cost. Almost none of them included post-approval cost. And making those adjustments, significantly modified the cost structure. Second thing I'll say, and then maybe I'll be quiet, is that, for Carbex, we started hit to lead. And the best that we can tell, it's, for every 20 to 30 to 40 hit to lead companies, projects, you might have one FDA approved drug come out the back end. So, hit to lead is a relatively inexpensive phase. It's a couple of $1 million. But, 1 out of 30 will make it. And that funnel narrows as you go forward. And all of those costs are cumulative. This is the cost of failure. But I also just think of it as the cost of science. If you knew how to do the science experiment right every time, it wouldn't be science. It'd be something else. So I'll stop there. Other people probably have great things.
Thanks for the overview. And I would like to turn to our other participants, and maybe Neil, starting with you, if there are any particular things you'd like to comment on. And you've thought a lot about some of these issues with sustaining antimicrobials after they get through that phase 3 level. But anything you'd like to add at this point?
Yeah, I think one thing that really hurts new drugs coming into a limited space, and let's take the antimicrobial resistant gram-negative space, which is sort of a paradigm, where you had a space prior to 2015 with some of the newer drugs finally getting approved, where there was really no effective treatment, and in fact, highly toxic treatment out there. And what we saw is even with drugs coming in with new activity and safety profiles into this space, it's taken 5 to 6 years to get any bit of traction in the U.S. market for the first drugs to come through approval. And part of this is that you have a limited number of infections in the United States. So even if you completely captured that market, it's going to be finite. With stewardship, there's going to be some cap on your return. So the first thing that's always struck me is the solution in every regard, to me, seems that it has to be a global solution. The disproportionate number of these infections are globally, so the need is there. And if there was some way to open up global access, and that's why I think the second part of this program is really so very important. The second challenge, I think, is that what it takes to get a drug approved is not what the use of the drug is going to be in the real world. So there's a period of time after approval where the community is figuring out where a new drug, even one with a well-defined indication in the place of need, like in the gram-negative space, figuring out how we use it, where we use it most effectively for patient outcomes, but also for stewardship purposes. So we really need, and we'll get to this in the session, I know, we really need real-world practical information showing utility of these drugs and giving clinicians, stewardship programs, hospitals, and healthcare systems the rationale and the solid evidence they need to justify higher up cost fronts for expense for using these drugs.
Yeah, great. Thanks for those comments. And Joseph, if I could turn to you next. You're living through this in one of the companies that's still persisting in this space and facing some of these challenges. Any comments from your standpoint of what resonates or what we ought to highlight from the analysis that Kevin just described of the size of these costs and where they come into the process of development and availability?
Yeah, no, I think Kevin's model is spot on in terms of the scope and scale of what's needed for a pull incentive. Honestly, we're viewing things like the Pastoral Act as basically our lifeline. We think it has the potential to be transformative in the antibiotic market. We think it's going to potentially drive an era of consolidation amongst the small biotechs, which I think ultimately would be a good thing. To have larger companies with, that are more well-resourced with more assets to move forward, and also a increased cadre of workforce and scientists that are actually developing these products. The scope and scale is right on. We're fully supportive. We'd love to see it get implemented correctly. I think it is important for the investor community to have a degree of certainty if Pasteur is passed of which types of antibiotics would qualify and which would not. A lot of the investor community right now is expressing a degree of skepticism about Pasteur and whether or not, what's in, what's out. And a lot of companies are basically going to be raising money off of that prospect going forward. So I think it really needs to be implemented thoughtfully. I think kind of this discussion of novelty versus addressing unmet medical need is a dialogue that needs to continue. But overall, I mean, we're very, very optimistic on this and would love to see it get further support on the Hill.
Yeah, it sounds like it would have a substantial impact, especially if funded at a level reflected in Kevin's analysis. And Monique, maybe I can ask you. You have a tremendous amount of experience in policy implementation related to urgent public health threats like this one, other types of public health emergencies like the one we're living through right now. One of the things that I've seen as being challenging for members of Congress and others is getting confidence that these programs are actually going to work. Kevin did a very comprehensive analysis, and as he pointed out, the answer to how much this costs on a per drug basis is it depends. So I wonder if you have any we've narrowed down the range. $3 billion, $3.1 billion globally is a overall midpoint, but depends on other things like other sources of support, many of the factors that we've already been discussing. Any thoughts that you have about turning these kinds of estimates into effective policy design and action by Congress and the administration?
Yeah, Mark, thank you. And thanks to your colleagues at Duke-Margolis for holding this important and timely discussion. And I've benefited greatly for almost 20 years now of working with you and thinking about these sorts of issues. We go back to Project BioShield and the whole premise of unmet medical need. And if you build it, we'll buy it premise. That was really, again, foundational to how the US government sort of started in this space. So I think it is important to realize that history, that 20-year history, and the broader portfolio of unmet medical need and medical countermeasures. I think one of the things three points I want to make. One is about positioning. And I want to build on what Kevin has presented about the value of these assets to the provision of medical care domestically and around the world. Absolutely. Check one. When me and the MITRE team has been working on this challenge, thinking more broadly about medical countermeasures and medical supplies, and like to view this in three lenses. So yes, medicine is one. The national security aspects of this. And I think, again, if we look at the relevance of what we're talking about here with antimicrobial resistance, what we are all living through and dealing with still with the threat of SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19 pandemic, to put these in the broader context beyond healthcare, yes, healthcare, and national and economic security. The availability of an industrial base that develops and supplies these goods and services is arguably vital in all three of those elements. So I think positioning this beyond healthcare is really important because that gets you to a different mind frame about the value of investment. So that's one. The other is the portfolio approach. Again, I really appreciate what Kevin and many of us think of a systems approach, and there are many elements, and as you drew out, Mark, in your opening, to look at the system and the ways that all of these complement each other, whether it's a stewardship, the early R&D, the pull incentives, all of these have to be in place in order to have a system that will work for all of us. So I think that's critically important. The other element, and Joe just touched on this, and this is central for all of the assets that we're talking about, is reducing the uncertainty. I mean, this has been over 20 years, arguably the greatest challenge in the medical countermeasure space, whether it's a COVID-19 vaccine. And you saw by taking the uncertainty out of it, the full harnessing of the power of the private sector to deliver a capability. So I think that's paramount, whether it's a target product profile for a particular product, and you've talked about sort of the relative value of particular assets, whether it's a novel sort of mechanism of action that would have enhanced value, really starting to put a price on that so that taking the guessing game, taking the uncertainty about the market value is critically important. And then a portfolio strategy, because again, we're still talking about this, I think, largely in a transactional way versus a portfolio strategy. First generation, next generation, how the antibiotics pair with that diagnostics, potentially vaccines and other countermeasures. So I think putting all of this in a broader systems approach is really going to offer benefits. And from a policy perspective, Mark, you'll appreciate this, especially the persistence over changes in leadership, changes in administration is going to be paramount. So putting things that are future-proof against those sort of swings in what's a priority and what's not. Again, all coming back to taking the uncertainty out of it for those that will develop these goods and provide the services and train a workforce and be able to defend opportunity costs from the other opportunities in their portfolios at the companies.
Yeah, I would like to pick up on, and we will keep coming back to that theme on reducing uncertainty. And in just a few minutes, we're going to turn to these systems issues. I think you frame very well. Thank you, Monique. Do you have a question for Arjun, though? And Arjun, your day job is very much focused on effective surveillance. And one of the goals of Pasteur and presumably one of the ways to reduce uncertainty about is this really going to be a beneficial way of supporting new antibiotics is coupling it to more effective supports for surveillance and effective use, effective stewardship. The whole nature of paying for a medical product based on a population level subscription rather than on an individual use would seem to help with that. But would you mind expanding a little bit on how to take advantage of that potential synergy in the implementation of a pull incentive like Pasteur?
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And I think it's a great point that you're raising and fully agree. This is the perfect solution to an incredibly vexing problem, right? This issue of being able to pull products to market, but then uncouple the use of the product from the profit or the payments that can be made. That is what we need for antibiotics. And it's what we've been talking about for such a long time. And it solves so many of these problems, right? This tragedy of the commons problem is over if you don't have to worry about the market share and how much of the drug is being used. So we really do think that this type of uncoupling is the ultimate solution to this incredible problem that we face. And you're absolutely correct. I think there's a key need here to think not just about the pull incentives that brings the drug to the market, but then what happens when the drug, both understanding what's the share, as Neil was kind of mentioning, we need to know, how much of this drug do we expect to be used in the United States, and making sure that we see the drug being used in the areas of the country that are seeing the problems of resistance where we would expect it to be used. And that is a situation, as you're talking about, Mark, where I think our surveillance data positions us very well to be able to do that. We now have capacity in CDC's National Healthcare Safety Network to collect information both on antibiotic use in hospitals, but also antibiotic resistance. And you can begin to pair those and see where you could have some really good comparisons of, if we have a new drug for KPC or carbapenem resistant Enterobacter rallies, are those drugs being used at a lot of hospitals that don't have any of those infections or very rarely have those infections? And you can also go the other way. And I think this is an important implication that people don't think about. Are there areas where the drugs are being underused? Someone was mentioning that in some of these cases, it takes a long time for people to adopt new drugs and begin to use new drugs. Well, if we can find places in the country where there's a hospital that has a lot of these carbapenem-resistant organisms, but is using very little of this new drug, that would be an indication for someone to call and say, hey, there's a drug that can treat some of these infections that you're seeing. You're not using it very much. Can we talk about why that might be? Maybe a perfectly good reason for that. But I think there are benefits on both sides when it comes to surveillance. So I think really continuing the investments in these surveillance systems, getting all hospitals online reporting, and we are working with CMS on some ways and options to both incentivize and potentially even down the road require more of this type of reporting, because I think ultimately that's what we will need to make sure that we are getting these drugs to the places where they need to be used most.
And I do want to come back to that as we expand out in the next part of this session to the opportunities for synergies. Right now, though, I want that you, Arjun, you anticipated my next question, which I'm sure is going to come up in Congress. Well, we're going to spend all this money. How do we know that it's really working? And for that, we really need some kind of meaningful performance metrics. We don't want to go by volume of sales. We want to go by other things. And you just suggested, I think, a couple of them. One would be what's going on in terms of antibiotic prescribing as we move away from fee-for-service payment and implement these kinds of antibiotics. Are we seeing more use in areas that where it seems appropriate? A second might be based on those same systems. Are we seeing less spread of resistant organism? That is the sort of the bottom line goal here. I wonder if I could open to the rest of the panel. What else would you like to look for? If you're answering a question from a member of Congress, how do we know that this approach is really working?
Well, I'll speak as a clinician. I think one thing I'd like to see is post-approval clinical studies, trial data, real-world settings that build upon some of the models that we've seen now with COVID that have actually worked quite successfully. So whether it's a model like REMAP, which University of Pittsburgh, for example, has been involved with, recovery out of the UK, solidarity out of the World Health Organizations, where perhaps you can have these platforms for adaptive, imaginative studies, asking real-world questions that are integrated into patient care. And I think this would get us to not only on the clinical end, understanding how better to use products, but also then showing value to stakeholders on the back end, showing that this investment has had real value. And I think it also ties in very nicely to points that Monique and Arjun made about new diagnostics. And this is something clinically that we're still operating sort of on this Pasteurian 19th century model that you recover a bug and you out of culture, identify resistance. We've got these molecular markers now that I think really need to be part of how we're doing clinical trials, how we're assessing endpoints, and how we're measuring the performance of new drugs. And I am encouraged anecdotally at meetings to hear for the first time, I think, pharmaceuticals and diagnostic companies coming together and thinking about how can we do these type of studies, do these type of trials that make maximum use of both our products. On the clinical community, we have to do a better job of thinking about how to use diagnostics, how to integrate them into patient care algorithms and models that improve outcomes, and then make better use of new and old drugs for that matter.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And the pass-through legislation does include sort of differential payments in effect tied to, well, the product may come to market with just one or a few narrow indications and non-inferiority. Let's get some more, let's provide some incentives and therefore create more infrastructure to support post-market studies on additional indications and stronger evidence of effectiveness. So that seems like a good set of measures for whether the program is working as well. Anything else that others would like to add?
Mark, I'd add, the strength of the portfolio. Again, I think most important, as you said, the reduction of the spread of antimicrobial resistant agents, that's the ultimate outcome, right? And patient safety and patient well-being, antibiotics prescribing. But if we look upstream at the health and well-being of the relationship between governments and industry and the ability to build a robust industrial base that might have relatively small biotech companies, as well as, again, multinational companies that sort of resume efforts and engagement and partnership, because the early stage R&D is important, but so is, again, the life cycle, the manufacturing, the training of a workforce. And this gives us a great opportunity because it is real and present to see if we can't accelerate, as we've all, I think, been amazed and inspired by the COVID-19 response for medical countermeasures. Let's put some urgency against this, right? Let's make one of these targets and see if we can operate on a almost pandemic-like response across the entire system. I really like the pull incentives and the complementary efforts that you presented in your opening. I think, again, the benefits and the carryover benefits in workforce and manufacturing capacity, public health, emergency preparedness, and sort of the economic sort of vitality of this sort of the capability to restore that again is critically important, again, in the systems view that I think Arjun and others have so eloquently spoken about.
Yeah, and that robust development manufacturing capacity is definitely something there's a lot of national interest in seeing, given what we've been living through now. So great points. And Joseph, no offense to the industry as it currently exists, but those measures of robustness seem like another good complementary set of ways of making sure it's going to take a few years, but ways of making sure that the program's having its intended effects and potentially the course corrections after implementation. Joseph, anything you'd like to add on this topic before I do want to switch? There are a lot of comments about the synergies between an effective pull incentive program like Pasteur and other things that we are potentially able to build on now to make a more robust environment for development and effective use of antimicrobials.
Yeah, no, I agree with Neil. Like resistant pathogen trials that are, on one hand, it doesn't allow us to put a new indication on the label, but on the other hand, it does inform kind of operational use by the clinician. It's valuable information to them. There's also a side benefit of it basically generates a more accurate breakpoint for our product, which we think is ultimately beneficial because in our phase 3 trial, the vast majority of organisms that we're treating or patients that we're treating don't have resistant organisms. And so it can kind of skew the breakpoint in the wrong direction. So that's a direction we're interested in. We'd love if we could advance the clinical science and feasibility of those studies to actually get that information on the label, because I think that's where the true value would be, but it's valuable nonetheless to inform clinicians' use.
It would be valuable to do, but given all the market challenges that we've talked about, without a clear financial incentive tied to demonstrating that benefit, it's probably not going to happen. So,
Right.
So I think it's a great point to end this first part of this panel on. So now we're going to transition to part 2 on advancing pull incentives through complementary actions. Remembering that important as pull incentives are, they could be made more effective by complementary changes that we hope are feasible in the ecosystem for developing and using priority antimicrobials. And we've already talked about this a bit, and I wanted to try to go through a little bit systematically what these additional dimensions might be. And let's start with surveillance and the related evidence that can be developed after market approval on just how well new antimicrobials are working. Arjun, you already started talking about this, and I'd like maybe if you could start up by expanding on that a bit, talking about some of the work that CDC is doing around surveillance and other systems to combat antimicrobial resistance. And let's pick up on this theme of how to make sure that a effectively implemented pull incentive program synergizes with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've talked about it a little bit, but just to expand on some of that, I think there are 2 parts to it. There is one is making sure that these new agents are being used in areas where we're encountering a lot of these resistant infections where they would be effective, right? That's a critical safety issue. And I think that's something that people don't usually think about when they think about surveillance for antimicrobial use. They tend to think of it more from the perspective of, we're looking to see that it's not being overused. But with some of these new drugs, I think the bigger push early on is going to be making sure they're not being underused. New drugs require education. People have to learn how to use them, what the indications are, how they work. And so we need to make sure that we're monitoring, where infections are occurring and making sure that these drugs are being brought to bear in situations where they would be effective. And as I mentioned, most of these are drugs that are going to be used in the acute care setting. And the advantage that we have there is we already do have an existing platform that's ready to get that information electronically from acute care hospitals with the National Healthcare Safety Network Antibiotic Use and Resistance module. We are already receiving data from over 2,300 hospitals electronically on antibiotic use, and we have more than 1,000 hospitals electronically reporting antibiotic resistance data. This is all voluntary reporting, but it has been growing very quickly over the past couple of years, and that's encouraging to see. But we need more of that, right? In order to really have this network built properly, we need every hospital in the United States to be reporting. And that's something that, like I said, we've been talking about with CMS. Are there ways to further incentivize that reporting or frankly, ways to simply require it? And you could envision that could there be requirements that, if there's no, the drugs are coming to you for no cost. Maybe one of the prices of being able to access these new drugs is, you need to be reporting this information, because I think that type of surveillance data is going to be absolutely vital to ensure that these drugs are being used properly, that they're getting to the patients who need them, that they're not being used in people who don't. So I do think that this type of surveillance is going to be really key. And it does have to be paired with the added capacity for diagnostic surveillance. We have to continue to build that really strong diagnostic infrastructure in the hospitals to be able to detect this resistance quickly. We do have a network now, in the United States, the Antibiotic Resistance Laboratory Network, where all 50 state public health laboratories, supported by 7 regional laboratories, really have expanded their capacity to do more advanced testing for antimicrobial resistance, to bring new resistant tests on quickly. And that's a capacity I think we do need to continue to grow. A lot of it is still culture-based. And as the technologies advance for non-culture-based rapid diagnostic testing, especially rapid detection of resistance, that's more capacity that we need to bring online as part of this kind of surveillance network.
Yeah, and I want to hear from others on the panel if they have comments on this too, about the importance of engaging healthcare providers, starting with hospitals that are facing the most serious of these infection needs in the short term, and are also, as Arjun said, involved in a lot of steps around surveillance and around appropriate stewardship, including avoiding underuse in high-risk infections. If others have comments on this, I'll just take off my moderator hat for a minute and participate a little bit, given my background on the payment side. Would say that what CMS has identified as a top priority for the agency for the longer term is to move away from the current way that we kind of deliver care, with an emphasis on specific services, especially ones that happen after people get complications, and instead towards more of a focus on population health and the best care for an individual and the people around them. And that generally means a movement away from fee-for-service payments and towards paying for better health and better outcomes. A foundation for that, as Arjun said, would be paying for developing the infrastructure and the data needed to know if you're getting better outcomes. And in the area of antimicrobial resistance, those are questions like, what is the status of resistance in my hospital, in my community? What are we doing to assure that the people with high-risk infections are getting treated appropriately and avoiding overuse of antibiotics that we need to preserve for the cases where they're really needed? And the ultimate outcome, or are we slowing down the spread of resistance in our community? And this seems like a natural fit with with the systems that you're describing and where CMS might be headed. A lot of the population health measures that CMS is focusing on now are understandably related to things like controlling cardiovascular risk factors and improving use of vaccination, other preventive services. But this seems like an important complement that's moving in the same direction. Just wondering if others have anything they'd like to add on this point. And I think there's a role too here for the private sector. As you mentioned, Arjun, in the PASTEUR legislation, this subscription would effectively replace payment for the antibiotics on a volume basis for public programs, but we'd like to see something analogous happen in the private sector, where again, Medicare Advantage plans, other commercial plans are trying to move in the same direction of focusing on population health. Any comments from the panel on this topic? And next, we're going to move on to some other systematic complementaries. Kevin, and Kevin, thanks for being faster than I am about making sure we get the Q&As, the many good Q&As questions coming from the audience, getting those addressed.
So I want to say it's almost 40 years ago that the Reagan administration brought in a revolution on how we pay for hospital care through Medicare and the bundle payment, the DRG. And one of the unanticipated consequences of that has been really to destroy the hospital-based market for antibiotics, because it's bundled in the DRG. This explains why Neil and many physicians like him, but why there's that long lag, between the availability of the drug. It's part of the explanation. And so I think that, put into historical context, your call for paying for value and population-based health, is a much needed step, to build on what we did 40 years ago, but also to recognize the limitations of that system. And so antibiotics might be a good place to try something different. And Pasteur is clearly a value-based thing, but also, there's some administrative action that could be taken to figure out what are the barriers within the hospital system to choosing the correct antibiotic that's best for the patient without the DRG overhang influencing that decision.
It's a great point. I think we have based on this discussion, a path forward for hopefully engaging on that as an important complement to Pasteur and getting the most bang for the buck out there. Let me talk about a couple of other areas that have already come up. One of those is clinical trials and real world evidence systems. So a big chunk of the costs that Kevin estimated were associated with both that pivotal trial to get to market, and then, as we heard from Neil, learning much more after a product that will typically come to market with a narrow non-inferiority indication or indications, how well it really works in practice. Pasteur is going to help with that by tying the payments to addressing those further important evidence questions. In addition, though, as Neil, as you said, maybe I go back to you, there do seem to be ways to bring down the cost of developing that evidence. So both from a clinical trial standpoint, you mentioned REMAP solidarity for people who aren't following closely the world of clinical trials in the COVID era. Turns out that if you're a hospital that's being slammed with a COVID surge, it's not very easy to collect a lot of the data by hand and all the other supportive steps for a traditional clinical trial. On the other hand, if we know something about a drug already, if it's already on the market, especially, there are now ways that we've seen through these trial networks, like Recovery in England and REMAP CAP, a US kind of complementary version, to make it simple, simplify the data collection, focus on key patient characteristics, outcomes that matter, like time to recovery or discharge from the hospital or survival, things that are collected anyway, and especially in electronic data systems, simplifying by ways of doing effective patient consent and trial randomization, and then learning from that. Now, we haven't seen that really applied, I think, Neil, to the antimicrobial context, but these platforms exist. And can you maybe say a little bit more about how they could help here in bringing down the cost of getting that additional evidence and the uncertainty and the time involved?
Yeah, right. I think there's terrific utility there potentially. I'll give you one example of a trial that actually is being done at the University of Pittsburgh now. There's a drug called fidaxomicin, which is a treatment for C. difficile. It's been on the market for over a decade. The standard treatment right now at most places is oral vancomycin. And after 10 to 15 years, we really don't know where fidaxomicin fits into treatment. And it is a more expensive drug. So this is an example where within routine practice, you can enroll patients in hospital, you can get randomization at the pharmacy level, and finally, after 15 years, a clinical trial to answer a very basic clinical question that ideally would have had answered within the first 3 to 4 years of the drug being on market is finally going to be identified. So now that the platforms are in place in certain systems, such as REMAP, it'd be nice to start this proactively as drugs are getting approved and get these sort of real world comparative utilization type of trials going at year 2, 3, 4, rather than year 10, 12, 15, as a drug is about to come off of patent. I think there's terrific utility in the sepsis space. I mean, this is a major, major problem. We throw antibiotics around willy-nilly. We're throwing broad spectrum A versus broad spectrum B. We're doing that already. Let's systematize it, do it properly, collect the data, and actually learn something about what matters. The final point I'll make, and you alluded to this, Mark, is different endpoints. So endpoints with real world utility, such as door endpoints, where you're looking not only at alive, dead, or microbiologic clearance or not, but you're looking at toxicity, safety, time to discharge, readmission. These things matter terrifically at a system level, but we do a very poor job of capturing, quantitating, and breaking silos down to justify antibiotic use for those type of endpoints. So I think this is an area where there's terrific potential, and COVID has accelerated that, I would think, by several years. Remap was there, 2019, they were sort of gearing up and ready to go, and then COVID hit, and I think it moved them forward by a decade. Mm-hmm. So let's build on that.
Great. And Monique, I know MITRE has been involved in a lot of efforts to bring evidence development to the real world through setting up registries in the COVID context and steps outside of COVID as well. Again, that kind of bring down the cost of getting the right data. If you have any additional comments on this topic, that'd be great. I also wanted to ask you about another topic I know you're you know a lot about, and that is the status of diagnostics. The trials are also going to work better. I think Neil raised this point earlier. If we understand well what exactly we're dealing with in terms of a particular organism and threat, if we don't have rapid, accurate diagnostics for patients in hospital who are have sepsis or other serious complications, it's hard to wait to get that answer, and that means you're throwing an antibiotic up against a very heterogeneous population, and it's hard to figure out who really benefits, let alone continuing to get the right antibiotic to the right patients. So if you could comment a bit on how opportunities around diagnostics could help make a program like Pasteur more effective, that would be great too.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. I think on the real world evidence, and MITRE had the privilege of leading this amazing coalition of hundreds of private sector entities that was doing federated analytics and trying to understand and support the global community about what protocols, what therapeutics were working, and sort of understanding the importance of providing that standardized sort of but federated framework for how you would analyze some of these novel therapeutics in near real time, I think is instrumental. And so I think the value, the opportunities and challenges with real world evidences have been nicely stated, Mark, by you, Neil, and others. I think, again, we all see the potential. I think this idea for precision, right? This idea that not an overarching sort of global assessment of antimicrobial risks, let's say, against a particular pathogen, but in my community, in my hospital, how quickly can we pick that up and how quickly can we share that? Share the knowledge and potentially share the countermeasures to the extent appropriate. So that's one. I think this idea of pairing the diagnostics with the therapeutic, with the antibiotics, is playing out in real time now. If you look at COVID-19, right? Learning where we need to have access to monoclonal antibodies or the antiviral pills is absolutely paramount right now. So this experiment is playing out in real time on a global scale with millions or billions of people. And I think the lessons we can learn about the interrelatedness between a therapy or a vaccine and a diagnostic are critically important. And I think that's a critical element of a systems approach. Right, the diagnostic has to, in this case, be paired with effective use of the medical countermeasure therapies for COVID-19. Similarly, for antimicrobial resistance, the same. So we have to look at those because we saw an example. I think it was earlier this summer, right, when we had in the U.S. the upscale of the vaccination campaign, and we had downsized some of the testing and diagnostics, and then we had the Delta surge, and we had to sort of recalibrate. So I think looking at how each of the utilization and the supply and demand models for an integrated sort of response need to be assessed together. So the diagnostic piece, again, let's leverage what we're learning now in a very high consequence, rapidly moving threat and apply that in near real time to the antimicrobial resistance space and the pairing with novel antibiotics.
Yeah. Yeah, this notion of paired diagnosis is getting increasingly important in medicine, whether it's drugs for Alzheimer's disease that are based on plaque status or cancer drugs, you name it. Kevin, do we need more of a paired diagnostic component to Pasteur?
Yeah. So you talk to the little companies and you tell them, oh, we want you to do I'll say a companion diagnostic, something that's part of the regulatory and commercial structure, but paired diagnostic too. And they say you want us to more than double our regulatory, technical, and scientific and commercial risk. Because we'll have to charge more, and we have to have both things work, and they got to both work together. So if you want this, then let's put that in Pasteur and offer a larger reward for doing this. A companion diagnostic or a paired diagnostic with a new drug, as opposed to what you would ordinarily pay for the drug by itself, right?
Yeah,
and then you got to make sure that the hospital. So this one should get the higher end, right? Because it's really quite the risky thing. No one wants to do it today, and you got to make sure you talk to people like Neil and docs at hospitals to make sure that the finances work for the hospital. The hospital doesn't somehow lose money from using this paired system.
Yeah, it's another area where again, fee for service or DRGs, as you were saying earlier, just don't work well unless we move more in the direction of sort of paying for better health. So are you actually using effective diagnostics and getting to better outcomes? Again, exactly the kind of metrics that we just talked about are going to be critical for Pasteur success and course corrections along the way. And maybe it's not the same companies, but maybe a similar kind of program we're thinking about. Joseph, let me go to you. So we don't want to turn your company into also a diagnostics development company. That'd be a lot of extra work. But you are being asked to do a lot here. Kevin alluded earlier. Do you want to switch maybe to talking about manufacturing at this point? That's a lot of costs in the Pasteur model, and I would say, from my experience, it's kind of a different and new skill set for companies that are starting up. So, how are you thinking about managing through that, assuming that these Pasteur reforms take effect?
Yeah, no, I mean, manufacturing is a significant component of our program, and it could stand to be a huge technical risk for us if we don't execute appropriately. More broadly, I think we're seeing a lot of this discussion about the domestication of the supply chain for antibiotics and drugs in general unfold. And for us, it's really highlighting where there are significant capability gaps for antibiotics, particularly in the US. We make a product called cefepime taniborbactam. It's the combination of the cephalosporin cefepime with a novel beta-lactamase inhibitor that addresses both serine and metallo-beta-lactamase producing organisms. We're an IV product, and basically we can't identify a place within the United States to do the last step of our manufacturing process, which is fill finish, where the drug actually gets put into the vial. And it's part of it is because there's an FDA regulation for beta-lactams and actually it's even more specific. It's for cephalosporins versus carbapenems versus monovactams, that you have to have dedicated fill finish lines for those products to avoid any sort of cross-contamination or allergy concerns related to penicillins. And so we're watching these dialogues unfold, and we're concerned, I guess, is one word that you could say, that just the capabilities to fully move our supply chain domestically just currently don't exist. It took us 30 years to kind of get into this situation with China and India. I'm hopeful that policymakers in the administration don't think that they can just wave a wand and have it all returned back to normal, and that they're thinking about making strategic investments in U.S. manufacturing capabilities that would allow us to domesticate our supply chain, because we would certainly do it if we could and if it was a priority.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot of interest, a lot of policy interest in strengthening the domestic supply chain. Maybe, Monique, I can go back to you on this one, since I know you've thought about it a lot. We've talked about it a number of times too, with interest at shoring up U.S. manufacturing and supply chains at pretty much every type of significant manufacturing for public health, healthcare preparedness. So, I mentioned the announcement just just very recently around additional mRNA platform manufacturing capacity in the U.S. That's presumably going to help diversify and increase our capacity to respond in terms of vaccine manufacturing. When David Kessler announced it, he was very quick to say this is not just about for the U.S., it's about for supplying the rest of the world as well. mRNA vaccine platform may not be the most relevant to many of the promising antimicrobials in development. But at the same time, there have also been recent federal investments and legislation pending around small molecule products. We're seeing that happen in the private sector too, with companies like Civica, sort of paying a bit more to have more reliable capacity on hand, so you avoid shortages of critical drugs when you need them. We're certainly seeing it in terms of interest in advanced biologic manufacturing, monoclonal antibodies, et cetera. A range of companies have been formed in the U.S. in response to this that wouldn't just manufacture for the government in an emergency, but are providing more reliable manufacturing for ongoing pharmaceutical companies, especially in complex biologic manufacturing, where those regulatory hurdles are understandably significant given the complexity of the manufacturing. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. Is that going to help, or maybe a better way to put it is, how can we make that interest carry over to helping with these problems? If we could bring down the cost uncertainty for people like Joseph when they do develop a product, and maybe have some, if we're aiming for excess or more robust U.S. manufacturing capacity anyway for public health emergencies, this seems like something that would be a good use of the companies, the investments, the domestic supply that seems to be coming in this space.
Yeah, a lot there to unpack, Mark. And, I would call on your help in your economist hat, because I do think we have to do a better job of making the business case and the cost of inaction on sort of an economic scale. I think that's what's at risk here. And I think that's what Civica, as I've heard Martin von Trieste speak publicly, it's the inherent sort of reaction to try and drive down cost, whether it's labor in another country or whatever the workaround is to try and lower the cost. Where what we're talking about, what Martin talks about, is for a few more pennies, you will get the supply chain surety and security, the quality and quantity of the product you need. But you've got to resist that impulse to try and squeeze the pennies out of these products, right? And I think these, again, are relatively low margin products, or making the economic case, the business case for why would I make product A versus product B. So that's point one. We have got to be very savvy in competing with C-suite executives at biotech and pharmaceutical companies about what the value proposition is here in this space. I think the other key element about this is, in part, the portfolio strategy. Again, what are we looking at with regard to novel products the distributed nature of one company, one manufacturing, capability, or what the U.S. government tried to do with the CIADMs, the Centers for Innovation, Advanced Development, and Manufacture, try and create sort of a pooled capability, if you will. And I think there's a lot to study and understand about what worked and maybe what didn't work, especially when you have products, as Joseph just mentioned, that require dedicated fill finish capacity. Again, there are some very, very important lessons to learn from very recent COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing, for example. The other key word, we're all excited about growing global domestic manufacturing capacity and the potential to, let's say in the case of mRNA, build capacity on the African continent, as Dr. Kessler talked about this morning. I think we also, again, have to study lessons learned from, it was a priority for BARDA a decade ago to build domestic manufacturing capacity for flu vaccines based on more traditional egg-based. Sustainability is hard. Again, the build, there's a lot of energy around the build right now, but there's got to be a business model to sustain. And I think that's where putting some of the antimicrobial opportunities for development and manufacturing, getting specific about the target product profile, what the specs are for fill finish, and then to look at the portfolio of products on pandemic preparedness from the viral, families. and look at what opportunities for synergies are. I think that will speak loudly to government leaders, policy leaders, when you look at those, 2-for-1s, if you will, right? Where you can really leverage the synergies and not try and just build a manufacturing capacity for one product or one company. But it's hard, and it really has to be done at a system level and as savvy with the business and economics as we are with the science.
Yeah, it does seem like what didn't work was sustaining, say, like a separate plant, ensuring it would be up to spec for whatever type of manufacturing ended up being needed in a public health emergency. And it does seem like, and I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth a little bit or leading the panelists, but there are a range of capabilities that I think there's strong awareness that we need to develop, both for pandemic responsiveness and for reliable biomanufacturing base in the United States and with our allies, and in a world where this is increasingly important and the manufacturing itself is increasingly complex. If we looked at the target product profile, as you were saying, that's needed for, say, pandemic preparedness or for avoiding domestic drug shortages, and compare that to the product profile that's needed for manufacturing of these priority antimicrobials that are being developed, my guess is there'd be a good deal of overlap. Again, maybe not on the mRNA platforms, but certainly on the small molecule drugs, the space where Civica has been working, probably on the advanced biologic manufacturing, monoclonal antibodies, maybe other cell-based or comphage, other therapies. And that seems like a real synergy opportunity. And we're going to end up having to, if we follow these policy recommendations from people like Scott Gottlieb and others, building in kind of a little bit more excess capacity than we might otherwise, and needing federal support to make that happen, finding synergies to use that excess capacity, including for response for antimicrobial preparedness. If we do develop valid Pasteur eligible products, seems like maybe a way of bringing down the cost, increasing the value of both programs. But we only have a couple of minutes left in this session, which has been great. I'd like to maybe end this picking up on a comment that you made, Monique, about getting sustainability here. So, maybe we're having a moment around antimicrobial resistance. Certainly seems like it from some of the recent announcements like Cures 2.0 this week. But as you mentioned with BARDA and previous public health responses, sustaining this over the long term is a challenge. The world's been grappling with acting on another long-term threat, global warming, the past couple of weeks. As Kevin pointed out, the cost of dealing with this global public health population health challenge, or a couple of fewer zeros on the billions or trillions at least than global warming overall. But how do we keep this on the front burner? Who would want to start with that?
It's the hardest thing to do. I think we have to acknowledge how hard it is because it's not real and present. It's not, again, the numbers that we're seeing for COVID-19, but we all, this community sees the projections and understands the cost of inaction. So again, I think we need to accept that this is going to continue to be hard. Preparedness always is hard if it's not in front and center. But leveraging the synergies, as you had, I think, very nicely laid out in your upfront slide, Mark, the synergies and the value add to the pandemic preparedness, to global public health, to really accentuate those that by working together, we really do benefit all. I think that's not just words. I think that we've got to get to the details of the TPPs and the manufacturing footprints, but I think that case is there to be made.
Now, Arjun?
I think that for too long, people think about preparedness as like, tabletop exercises and pandemic plans. And I think if we can shift people towards a mindset where the best way to prepare for an emerging novel pathogen is to have a really good ability to respond to current emerging novel pathogens. And that's what AR threats are, right? So if we can respond effectively to carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterales, respond effectively to Candida auris, we'll have an effective capacity built. And so I think if we can shift people's mindsets to, we are going to embed all of our preparedness work in this concept of AMR response, including the diagnostics and therapeutics, That's our response capacity moving forward. I think that would position us in a much, much better place. Let's take some of that preparedness funding and move it over here.
Yeah, and back to where we started earlier in this conversation, Pasteur could be linked to specific goals around exactly those points. So measurable progress may be a way to keep people engaged. I want to thank all of you, especially Kevin, for setting us up and for the hard work that went into updating, making those estimates about what it costs to solve this problem more complete. But I want to thank all of you for putting those in context, practical context, the complementary steps where it does seem like we've got a lot of opportunities to really leverage the momentum behind approach like Pasteur, new payment models and in terms of pull incentives, but also in the rest of our healthcare system and in our public health emergency preparedness. Great discussion and look forward to more progress. Right now, I'd like to turn to our last session, expanding the focus, although we've talked about it already, the global context. Pull incentives are not just a U.S. issue because antimicrobial resistance is not just a U.S. issue. As was pointed out in some of the Q&As, more of the resistance that we're facing today, the bulk of that resistance is elsewhere in the world and much in low and middle income countries. Fortunately, the U.S. isn't the only country that's responding right now. And again, with this notion of maybe this is a time, some real synergies that we can talk about related to Pasteur, the complementary steps around surveillance and evidence development and the like that we've talked about in the last session. Similar interests happening in the rest of the world. And so we'd like to bring that together in this session. And I'd like to introduce our panelists, Christine Ardal, who's senior researcher at the Institute of Public Health in Norway, implementing a program like the one that we're talking about implementing here. Nick Crabb, similarly, involved in England's experience. He's public director for scientific affairs at the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in the United Kingdom. Lynn Philpy, senior advisor at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, working on the global extensions of this and related important public health matters. And Celine, sorry if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong, Mater, who's chair of the expert advisory group at the Global R&D Hub. It's been great working with you on these issues in recent years as well. So again, want to remind the audience to submit questions and thank Kevin for answering, helping us answer many of them. We'll incorporate that into this discussion too. But I'd like to start by giving each of our panelists a chance to make some introductory remarks that might include what they're doing in this space and also building on or reacting to what you heard in the first session about where we are in the United States. So maybe we can start with Christine for that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Mark. Really exciting, very exciting session already today. I think it's really interesting, to talk about the dynamics between preparedness and ensuring that we're stimulating antibiotic innovation. So one of the things, I'm sitting here in little Norway. Norway's smaller than Minnesota. We're only 5 million people here. And we're also talking about, production problems and all of these things. But we're still working in a global society, and we need to have global production chains. And one of the things that we're looking at when we talk about preparedness isn't necessarily pandemic preparedness, but how do we make sure that our healthcare system continues to have the antibiotics that it needs in order to continue to operate well? And those new antibiotics that we're really looking for aren't, maybe those antibiotics that you'd be looking for in a pandemic situation where you really want, broad spectrum antibiotics that will handle most of the infections. What we're looking for is more narrow spectrum that we can use with complementary diagnostics to ensure that we're handling that. So we hope that, really the focus, because the US will of course lead the way in this, but we'll really be promoting not only pandemic preparedness antibiotics, but also those that we really need to make sure that we're carefully stewarding. But the EU is also slower than the US. So great news that Cures 2.0 has come a step further, but the EU has committed now to also design a pull incentive. That process was put out to tender by the EU. But it's going to be slower. So it's probably about a 2-year process for the design to come up, which can be, of course, good because it could be influenced by other processes like Pasteur and also the learnings from England and other pilots. So we're working on it, maybe not as quickly as what the US hopefully will see, but progress is coming, hopefully.
Great. Well, I appreciate your optimism about the U.S. Congress capacity for bipartisan action. I'm hopeful as well. Thanks, Christine. Nick, can I go to you next?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. And it's great session so far, and really pleased to be involved in it. I thought it might be useful just for me to give a very quick sort of update on the sort of pilot that we're sort of running in England. As some of you may be aware, that the project's aim is to demonstrate the feasibility of new models that pay companies for antimicrobials based on their value to our National Health Service rather than the volumes used. So the model's really based on two main principles. One is a sort of health benefit evaluation. So really trying to work out what the value of the antimicrobials are, and with reference back to Kevin's opening presentation, being very sort of mindful that the benefits from antibiotics are much broader than the benefits of those patients directly treated. So taking account of sort of Kevin's steady values there. And the idea is that health benefits evaluation then sort of feeds into the payment levels in a subscription style payment model. And we feel that a fully delinked subscription style payment model is a really good way of overcoming the sort of issue of needing to sort of pay for the value, whilst at the same time encouraging appropriate stewardship. And again, thinking back to some of the comments previously, I think underusage as well as overusage are really important issues. So the details of these models need to be absolutely right, so that the only sort of factors taken account of when prescribing are the needs of the patients in front of a clinician or a multidisciplinary team, and also minimizing antimicrobial resistance. They should be the only two considerations influencing those decisions, and trying to get the detail right around sort of subscription models to facilitate that is both difficult but also very important. Again, as some of you may be aware, we sort of selected two products, cefuridocol and ceftazidime with avibactam, through a procurement process. And that procurement process was actually really important in that it meant that a lot of the contracting issues have already been dealt with through that process. So we're hopefully at the fairly advanced stages now where once we've got that sort of health benefit evaluation, that can sort of be that can be taken account of in sort of final commercial discussions. But hopefully, we should be able to move quite quickly to those subscription models being in place. So, in terms of key sort of milestones ahead of us, we've actually got the sort of committee meeting. So we set up a special advisory committee specifically for this project, and they will be doing their sort of detailed deliberation leading to their sort of estimates of the value to the NHS, and they're happening in January and February for the two different topics. And obviously what we don't yet know is how complex the final commercial discussions around the price, the subscription levels will be. But depending on how well and how quickly they go, we're sort of anticipating that the subscription payments will actually be in place sometime in spring 22. So hopefully we're now getting towards the sort of the late stages of the project. Mark, I know we're short of time, so I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
No, those are great comments. I appreciate the update. And England is farthest along on this effort, thanks to what you're doing. And you did a great job of summarizing where you are and the policy process. If I could ask you just a couple of follow-ups. One is you saw the numbers in Kevin's estimate. Kevin also, I think, concluded that, well, with steps like this one, with his estimates in it, and the numbers that we're seeing so far, at least coming out of the NICE process in the UK, he seems to think we're a long way towards getting to where we need to be globally. Is that your assessment? How much more are we going to need other countries to step up if the US and England and Sweden, Christine, go through with these efforts?
Yeah, well, I think what Kevin was indicating, and I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what he was indicating that if everybody paid a sort of fair share based on the sort of level that the UK is indicating, then we'd be okay. I don't think he's saying that the US, UK, and Sweden alone would get the job done. But one other quite important clarification is that what we've set out to do in our project is to pay for the value to the NHS, and we're trying to capture that quantitatively, and that is really tough. Actually, it's really tricky. So the later stages of the project are going to be really interesting. But in addition to that sort of paying for the value based on quantitative health economics, we also introduced a cap value for the purpose of these pilots, and we based that cap level on a sort of fair share. And I'm really pleased that our calculations have ended up being broadly in line with the work that Kevin's done. But just for clarity, we're expecting to pay based on the value to the NHS, and it's capped by the sort of levels that Kevin's saying are aligned to his research.
Great. Thanks for that clarification and how it might be extended more globally. I guess the other follow-up, and maybe you answered it right now, is you're pretty far along in this implementation, certainly farther along than the US is. What's been the most challenging part of this process that would be a good opportunity for the US to draw some lessons? It sounds like it may be this value calculation effort. I mean, it's not just a matter of calculating like what does it cost to develop a drug, but if you really want to prioritize innovation where it's most needed, focusing on that population health value seems really critical.
It is, and I would say that has been the most difficult element, and we've certainly been drawing very, very heavily on very advanced health economics expertise in the UK, and that's one of the reasons I'm really pleased to see that the work that Kevin's recently published, because there are different ways to approach these things. Coming up with a value now, because the UK bases its sort of quantitative health economics is very, very heavily ingrained in the UK sort of system. So almost inevitably we were going to have to go down that track first, It's fair for me to say that it's difficult. It's probably possible, but it's difficult, and we'll get some really helpful learning on that over the next sort of 6 months or so from our project. But of course, Kevin's work provides the basis for almost a fair share. So you could almost say, well, irrespective of what the value of an individual product is in sort of terms of quality adjusted life years, there's still a public health emergency. We still need new antibiotics. So how much does it cost to provide an incentive to support those antibiotics? And I think we almost inadvertently came up with our own fair share model, but we did it just in the context of creating a cap. But I think that together with Kevin's latest sort of research, it gives another potential basis for working out what the value of those payments should be, and I think it's really useful to have have more than one option.
Great. Thank you. And I'd like to go to Colleen next, since I know, Colleen, you all have been working similarly on costs and burden associated with development of priority antimicrobials. So your perspectives on what you've heard today?
Yeah, no, this was certainly a very interesting discussion, and certainly the framing of Kevin's presentation was a bit reminiscing of quite a few findings that we had outlined in the report of the Global AMR R&D Hub. Maybe just to put a little bit of numbers onto that dichotomy of access and innovation here. So in our report, what we found is that, and again, all of it is based on the surveillance data that we have currently and modeling and projections, but 92% of the need is in low and middle income countries. 70% of the revenue is in high income countries. So you can see we're already starting with a very numbers are very far from each other, and this is where we're trying to think here as to how we reconcile things. So thinking about the numbers outlined by Kevin before, so certainly those pull incentives are super important, and we know that they're crucial to get antibiotics to market whole. But in reality, to which markets? And this all boils down to who's paying these pull incentives. That's a personal opinion from my side. I do not see the Pasteur Act mandating pushing drugs into different markets globally and paying for that, or putting it as a requirement of receiving those pull incentives. So we are in a place where, yes, there will be money, and this is exactly the topic of this discussion, coming from potentially the US and the UK, and yet the need is somewhere completely different. So how can we think about the fair share that Nick has been discussing? In a fair share, or the value proposition to the NHS in the UK is very different in reality to what the value of a new antibiotic may be for the health system in Turkey or in India, etc., or in Iraq, 4 gram-negative infections specifically for MDRs. So I think that we need to reconcile things, and we need to have a conversation about what really is this fair share, and how does it really look like specifically for countries who absolutely need those drugs versus ones who may need other drugs as well. So I think it's a little bit of a complex discussion. And in the hub, we are going to be looking over the next few months at quantifying some of those numbers and looking at different models and trying to come up with some numbers that would help others too. I think a lot of eyes are on what's going on with the NHS, and if this is a model that can be scaled up to other places. And we are certainly very interested to hear how that experiment goes afterwards, to see if we from our end can contribute to any data to inform those discussions on a global level, specifically from the access perspective.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And as Christine said, there does need a path forward in the EU over the next couple of years that could benefit from that type of analysis, as well as hopefully the US experience. So maybe next I could turn to Lynn. So Lynn, you've had a chance to hear a lot of perspectives from other countries on how to pull together on the pull incentives, as it were. Appreciate your perspectives on where we are and how we can move these global collaborative efforts forward most effectively.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really happy to be invited back to speak on pull incentives again. And as usual, really interesting discussions here. Tomorrow, as a reminder for everyone, starts World Antibiotic Awareness Week.
Yeah. This
year's theme is Spread Awareness, Stop Resistance. And also WHO is asking everyone to wear light blue to show their support for World Antibiotic Awareness Week. So please keep that in mind. But when we spread awareness, there's something that always catches my attention in these discussions. When we're in the US and we're talking about this, when we're with our G7 partners, in certain conversations, it's like we're preaching to the choir. Everybody acknowledges that antibiotics are different. Antibiotics are a drug that we're asking to be made made available, and then put on a shelf and not used till absolutely necessary. And that changes not only how we build capacity with our global partners, but just how we use these drugs in general. But that awareness isn't universal. We still have an uphill battle globally in educating many of our global partners that this is something that they should be prioritizing, and that looking at the market and looking at their own markets is something that's worth their time. And so there's a lot of work here still to do for the US, and I would argue for the UK and our like-minded countries like Norway, our partners like the EU. We're not there on awareness yet. There's still quite a bit of work to do. And we are working on it. This year, the UK held the presidency for the G7. And this was really well done. And I think there's a lot here that we can build off of next year in the G20 when Indonesia takes over, and to get that wider perspective from the G20 countries. But in June, when the health ministers met, and that is Secretary Becerra for us here in the US, they tasked their ministries to develop a set of shared valuation principles. And those valuation principles are supposed to guide us in what we're talking about here today. We're not valuing these drugs by the number of pills sold. So how do we value them, and how do we put a dollar amount on that? And I'm excited to announce that those did get sent to the ministers this morning. I won't preempt the UK's announcement on what we got on that. I'll leave it to them to share the results and the particulars of this morning's meeting and those valuation principles themselves. I will say they'll look very familiar to people who saw Kevin's presentation a little over an hour ago. But I would like to share a little bit more on US priorities and policies that were discussed while building those principles. And, I think it's fair to say that we are committed to building a sustainable supply of high quality and effective new drugs and maintaining our existing antimicrobials. And these pull incentives can help us do that. And we're not demanding that everybody create the same mechanism. It could be subscription models, it can be reimbursement reform, it can be prizes, etc. But what is important, and where I think we had some really nice G7 agreement and discussion this year, is that we do have to remove reimbursement from the volume of antimicrobial sales, from the number of pills sold. And we absolutely must take into account robust stewardship and access plans. And those are built into PASTEUR. They're also built into HHS's approach to whatever we do once we get PASTEUR, and what our backup plan is if PASTEUR does not move. Because while I still have my fingers crossed that it will, HHS is not just sitting around waiting. We are developing a backup plan so that we can see something move forward. We are committed to creating a pull incentive. Right. So as we all know, stewardship is absolutely critical. And so is access. We need to treat people with infections everywhere. If we don't contain those infections, we will increase resistance. So those are part of our approach. They will be included in our pull incentives. And the US is, again, very supportive of taking this out of the G7 to the G20 and wider, because we recognize that we do need everyone's ground truth and perspective on how these pull incentives can help everyone. The reality is that all 194 countries do not have the capacity to create a market for new drugs. And they don't have the capacity, many of them, even for the generic drugs. So we have a large uphill battle ahead of us. Thanks.
Yeah, so some great comments, and thanks for the new announcements too. I want to go to Christine next. You may be responding on this, but Lynn sort of put out the challenge ahead around, we are all linked together globally. Resistance that emerges elsewhere in the world is facing the most burden of it now, is going to have an impact here in the United States, just like COVID variants emerging elsewhere certainly have an impact here too. And Christine, maybe if you have any response to Lynn's challenge about how do we overcome, I think it's not just a matter of sort of education and awareness. It's how do we take some systems, get systems in place, maybe set some shared goals around making progress in this area.
Well, luckily, the WHO did set out its priority pathogen list in 2017, which was a first step. And now, we see that there is shared goals around which of those pathogens that the countries are prioritizing. And I think the thing about what we're looking forward to now is really, with bated breath, to look forward to these assessments by NICE about these two antibiotics and how you can really look at this additional value, because I think this is really going to enlighten countries, especially a lot of the higher income countries that are using HTA, how they can too integrate societal value into the value of antibiotics. But we've got to see, just like Lynn said, we've got to see a variety of pull incentives that work together, maybe not the same pull incentives, but those that work together in order going towards shared goals. And, we've already done some of this work. GARD-P, has done phenomenal work. If we look at Joe's company's antibiotic, cefepime taniborbactam, they've got a license already with GARD-P. And GARD-P has licensing rights.
And if you don't mind, for the audience, maybe a minute on GARD-P.
Oh, sir, sorry. I can try. Hopefully, Jan can correct me if I say anything incorrect. But GARD-P is a product development partnership. So it partners with companies in order to develop high priority antibiotics, and then takes licensing rights, as far as I understand it, to geographic areas of the world. And
it's got very much that global focus, the kind of the WHO global public health, global antimicrobial threats that you were mentioning earlier. Yeah,
absolutely. So they're formed out of WHO and the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative. So they definitely have a focus on low and middle income countries. And really, Venatoric's product, which is considered innovative by WHO against a critical priority pathogen, that might be available in a low and middle income country before it's available in European countries. And that might be perfectly appropriate depending upon the resistance patterns. So really, we've got to look at how all these different initiatives that we've got going really do support each other. And I think that's one of them. Secure, GARD-P is also working on an initiative called Secure with WHO, which can help to actually distribute and get over some of those regulatory hurdles in low and middle income countries. So I think I'm not worried that every country, all 194 countries in the world, have to implement the pull incentive, but I think it's those high income countries that really need to get the skin in the game. And so that's why it's exciting that the EU is committed to the designing of this pull incentive. And hopefully that would mean committing to the design will mean committing to the implementation as well. But really looking at those synergies. The UK has done a great job in leading the way. I don't think a fully delinked model will fit in the EU because healthcare is a national competency. So we need to look at other solutions, but those are definitely there. We have partially delinked models. The Swedish model could potentially work well in a European context with a negotiable, flexible revenue guarantee amount. Sweden's implemented a national revenue guarantee. So you could think of that along the lines of European methods with the COVID-19 vaccines. So there's a lot of exciting possibilities coming up. And I think the thing is that we're talking to each other and we're building on each other's efforts.
Yeah, great. And I appreciate your point about the high income companies stepping up, getting skin in the game, but doing this in a way that very much engages and has participation from low and middle income countries, where not only the awareness, but the practices using these new antibiotics as well as existing antibiotics also need to change. We just have a couple minutes left. This has been very informative about the global context and the opportunities for moving forward. If we're just going to ask you in just a minute, quick summary. Yesterday at the call to action on AMR, the keynote speaker, Dr. Nima Kaseje, said, we need a net zero target for AMR, something that people can remember, a goal here. What would you all put on the goal list? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but something that's really going to communicate clearly to the rest of the world what we're trying to accomplish. Nick, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'd really want to see in the reasonably short term would be real impact on the pipeline of antimicrobials. When you compare number of antimicrobials in human clinical trials with oncology, for example, there's just no comparison. So I'd like to see a lot more antibiotics in human clinical trials.
Thank you, Kayleen.
Being on this innovation panel, I may be the dissent voice, but I would want to actually see specific targets for stewardship and specific targets for surveillance, and in hoping to see specific indicators on reversal of some of the resistance patterns that we see globally. So
that is a net zero equivalent. Yeah, Christine.
So I understand from Kevin that Carbax has 18 new classes of antibacterials currently in the preclinical pipeline. My goal would be to see none of those fail for economic reasons.
Thank you. And Lynn, last word for you.
Christine's is a hard one to beat, but we do have targets with the SDG goals now, thanks to WHO. I'd like to see us meet those. And then also, I would like us to do a better job on IPC. We've learned a lot from the COVID-19 pandemic, not just about what can be implemented in hospital systems, but the basics: clean water, washing hands, staying home when you're sick. All of those can help us prevent infections and resistance in the first place. And if we can get that message out there and get people, taking those basic steps, we'd be far ahead.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for a very concise and really world-spanning discussion in this last half hour or so to put what we've talked about here in the U.S. in a global context in a way that also shows a challenging, as you said, Lynn, but constructive path forward. And I see a foundation for a lot of progress. We've outlined a number of ways to build on that today. So I want to thank all of our panelists, everyone who's participated, all of you who sent in questions to help shape our discussion and stimulate some back and forth in the Q&A box. It's been a great full discussion, one that has laid out, I think, a path forward, both for the U.S. and further steps globally to make the most out of the opportunity we have around Pasteur here in the U.S. and promoting effective pull incentives as part of a comprehensive strategy on getting to net zero, if not better, on antimicrobial resistance here in the United States and around the world. Also, just a final special thanks to our team here at Duke-Margolis, responsible for putting this all together: Marion Hamilton-Lopez, John Bollinger, especially Nicholas Harrison. Was emailing with him late last night and early this morning. More to come on this. At Duke-Margolis, we're very pleased to be collaborating with all of you on such an important and urgent global public health issue. For now, take care and have a great afternoon.